If you only followed Western media, you would think that China and Russia are hated all around the world. Western governments and corporate media outlets portray China and Russia as unpopular, isolated rogue states. But in reality, in much of the global South, people see things very, very differently. And I should stress that when we talk about the global South, we're actually talking about the global majority. The Western countries in the global North, which colonized most of the world, only represent 14% of the global population. 86% of the world population is in the global South. They are the global majority. And many countries that make up this global majority actually have quite positive views of China and Russia. This is especially the case in Latin America, a region where the US has militarily intervened in almost every single country. And the US government has backed dozens of coups d'etat against democratically elected governments in Latin America, trying to impose its imperial hegemony on the region. And today we see more and more US government officials, especially in the Donald Trump administration, who have invoked the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine to claim that Latin America is supposedly Washington's backyard and that the US should control the region. The US government constantly violates the sovereignty of countries in Latin America, so it's entirely understandable that many countries in the region are deepening their partnership with China and Russia because they see that Beijing and Moscow actually respect their sovereignty and have supported them in many tangible ways, unlike Washington that has only hurt them. And a perfect example of this is Nicaragua. This is a country in Central America that has been invaded by the United States 3 times. And from the 1930s until 1979, the US propped up a brutal right-wing family dictatorship in Nicaragua, the Somoza dynasty, that ruled the country with an iron fist on behalf of US business interests. And in the 1970s, the people of Nicaragua took up arms and waged a revolutionary struggle against the US-backed right-wing Somoza dictatorship. And in 1979, the left-wing Sandinista National Liberation Front overthrew this US-backed dictatorship and launched a revolution. And immediately after the victory of the Nicaraguan people who just regained their sovereignty, the US government waged another war on Nicaragua, using the CIA to arm and train a far-right terror group, the Contras, who used extreme terror tactics and burned down schools and hospitals to try to overthrow the revolutionary Sandinista government. A former commander of the US-backed Contras published a very revealing article in the New York Times in 1986 titled "Terror is the Most Effective Weapon of Nicaragua's Contras." This was written by Edgar Chamorro, who is from one of the most powerful and one of the wealthiest families in Nicaragua, and he acknowledged that he had previously led the Contras, but he resigned because he said, quote, "The Contras were and are a proxy army controlled by the US government. If US support were terminated, they would not only be incapable of conducting any military activities against the Sandinistas, but would also immediately begin to disintegrate. I resigned rather than continue as a CIA puppet," end quote. This former Contra commander also admitted that, quote, "It was premeditated policy to terrorize civilian non-combatants to prevent them from cooperating with the government," end quote. And he described some of the horrific crimes committed by these CIA puppets. He also admitted that the Contras were being led by the former National Guard of the Somoza dictatorship, the right-wing family dynasty that was a puppet regime backed by the US for over 4 decades. Now, again, this writer was from one of the most powerful right-wing oligarchic families in Nicaragua, and he was very anti-Sandinista. He, again, was a commander of the Contras, but he had to admit the truth. In this article, he wrote that the Sandinistas, quote, "have made enormous advances in education, housing, and healthcare. Unfortunately, the Contras burned down schools, homes, and health centers as fast as the Sandinistas build them. The Sandinistas must be credited with creating an atmosphere of genuine equality for the first time in Nicaragua's history. By contrast, the Contras, who were my colleagues, talked mostly of recovering their lost wealth and privileged status, end quote. Now, that article was written in 1986, but everything that he said is still very accurate for today. In 2018, the US government backed another very violent right-wing coup attempt in Nicaragua that tried to overthrow the Sandinista government. And this coup was backed by many of the same right-wing oligarchic forces in Nicaragua that have been desperate to overthrow the Sandinistas, to reverse the revolution, to privatize the public healthcare and free public education systems, to cut spending on the massive social programs that have helped poor and working class Nicaraguans. And the US government has been strongly supporting these extremist forces. Meanwhile, as the US has been terrorizing Nicaragua and invading it and violating its sovereignty, not just for decades, but for literally centuries, you know what China has been doing in Nicaragua? China has been massively investing in building infrastructure. So China, in partnership with Nicaragua, is building a massive international airport. China has gifted Nicaragua hundreds of new state-of-the-art buses to help to expand public transportation. China has helped Nicaragua to expand its ports so it can deepen its trade with other countries, so it's no longer completely dependent on trade with the US, which historically it has been. China is helping Nicaragua build a massive solar plant so it can have more renewable energy and be less dependent on oil imports. And China has also been helping Nicaragua to build large public housing communities. And in July 2025, Nicaragua just opened a new social housing community with 920 houses that were built with support from China, with materials that were given as a gift by China as an act of solidarity with the people of Nicaragua on the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. And they have plans to build thousands of more houses. This is just one example of a new housing community that has provided dignified houses for thousands of Nicaraguan families from poor and working class backgrounds. So it's no surprise that China and also Russia are seen very favorably in Nicaragua as allies, partners of the country that are helping Nicaragua to develop. Well, the US has been constantly attacking Nicaragua, invading, undermining its sovereignty, exploiting it, taking its natural resources, the exact opposite. And the president of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, who's the leader of the Sandinista Revolution, delivered a speech at an anniversary celebration on the 19th of July, celebrating the 46th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. And he talked about how China and Russia have been close friends of Nicaragua and have been helping the country to defend its sovereignty amid constant attacks by the US empire. In stark contrast to the propaganda narrative that we hear from Western corporate media outlets that simply regurgitate what Western governments say, President Ortega argued that from the perspective of Latin America, China and Russia are forces of peace and stability in the world that are helping to provide balance in a multipolar world against US global unipolar domination. Listen to this clip here from President Ortega's speech. And just a note, I used artificial intelligence to translate from Spanish to English because in the past I've put subtitles, but sometimes people have complained. They say they prefer listening rather than reading the subtitles. So I used AI technology to translate it. So it's still President Ortega's voice. You can hear what he actually sounds like, but translated into English.
The People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, they want peace for the world. They promote peace for the world. They promote solidarity for the world. They promote aid for the people. And even with the profoundly challenging and complex global situation that currently exists, marked by various geopolitical tensions and significant international complexities, we observe that powers such as the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation are actively and diligently moving forward in their dedicated efforts to seek and establish lasting peace, consistently promoting a more stable and harmonious global environment through their diplomatic initiatives and collaborative endeavors.
Now, this massive celebration of the 46th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, which was held in the heart of Nicaragua's capital, Managua, featured diplomatic representatives from many countries, including China, Russia, Palestine, Vietnam, Venezuela, Cuba, Honduras, Burkina Faso, Algeria, Turkey, the DPRK, Belarus, Cote d'Ivoire, and Myanmar. Nicaragua thanked these countries for being friends of Latin America who have helped the region to defend its sovereignty and develop economically amid constant U.S. meddling and attacks. And in this speech, President Ortega recalled some of the history of Western colonialism in Nicaragua going back to Spanish colonization.
Imperialists, colonialists who came from Europe to seize the sacred and ancestral lands of our forefathers, to threaten them with death if they did not get baptized, to threaten them with death if they did not hand over all the gold, and they were officially sent forth by the powerful kings of Spain, and they continue to commit them, the European imperialists.
President Ortega noted that Central America won its independence from Spanish colonialism in 1821. However, just a few decades later, the U.S. Empire replaced the Spanish Empire, and the U.S. Empire tried to colonize Central America as well. And in 1855, a U.S. mercenary leader named William Walker, who was just a random white guy from the U.S., who was an ardent colonialist who believed in the idea of manifest destiny, the colonial U.S. doctrine, he got together a mercenary army and he invaded Nicaragua in 1855, and he declared himself the unelected so-called president of Nicaragua. Again, this random colonialist from the U.S. claimed he was the president, and he reinstated slavery in Nicaragua, which had been abolished. By the way, Central America abolished slavery back in 1824. The so-called enlightened, so-called democratic United States did not abolish slavery until 41 years later in 1865, after the brutal Civil War, of course. And many colonialists like William Walker had profited a lot from slavery and wanted to expand slavery into other parts of the world as they expanded the U.S. empire. This U.S. mercenary, who imposed himself as the dictator of Nicaragua, instated slavery. He was eventually defeated in a local war and he was expelled. But before he left the country, he burned down the major Nicaraguan city, Granada. Here, President Ortega recalls some of this history.
In the year 1821, full independence was finally achieved. And in 1855, just imagine, the Yankees came down on us. William Walker invaded us. They came to take over the San Juan River, a significant and vital waterway, and worked closely with various American companies and businesses.
Then in 1912, the U.S. military directly occupied Nicaragua, basically turning it into an unofficial U.S. colony for 2 decades. However, a Nicaraguan revolutionary leader named Augusto Cesar Sandino created a guerrilla army that was called the Army in Defense of the National Sovereignty of Nicaragua. And he waged a guerrilla war against the U.S. colonial occupiers for several years. And in 1933, Sandino defeated the U.S. empire and he forcibly expelled the U.S. military. This is where the name Sandinista comes from. The Sandinistas are the followers of Sandino. However, although the U.S. military was expelled, Nicaragua was not able to protect its sovereignty because a year later, in 1934, Sandino was betrayed and killed by a U.S. puppet, Anastasio Somoza, who was the leader of Nicaragua's National Guard that had been created by the US military, and Somoza was educated from the US. He was from a very wealthy right-wing oligarchic family in Nicaragua that supported the US empire. And he became a dictator who governed Nicaragua as a US puppet until his death, and then his son took over, and the right-wing corrupt Somoza dynasty controlled Nicaragua until the victory of the Sandinista Revolution in 1979. And finally, after so many decades of fighting for its freedom from US colonialism, the Sandinistas were able to restore Nicaragua's sovereignty. This is why they were called the Sandinista National Liberation Front. They wanted national liberation from US colonialism. However, immediately after the victory of the revolution, the US started another colonial war in Nicaragua, supporting the far-right Contra terror group. And in his speech on the 46th anniversary of the revolution, President Ortega described how US President Ronald Reagan armed and trained the Contra terrorists, and also how they were involved in drug trafficking. And many of those drugs, by the way, ended up back in US neighborhoods, especially poor neighborhoods and majority black neighborhoods in the US, which fueled a horrific public health crisis. And all of this was described by the journalist Gary Webb in his book, Dark Alliance. But here, Nicaragua's president, Daniel Ortega, makes brief reference to it.
The victory was in 79, but the Yankees continued the war. It was a significant and widely supported war, to the profound point that the President of the United States even explicitly said that he was also a Contra, that he actively sought substantial funding to provide essential weapons, comprehensive training, and indeed everything necessary to the counter-revolution, that he sent them to train extensively over in the United States and sent them to train at various military bases that had been specifically and strategically set up here in Honduras. He gave them tremendous weaponry, and President Reagan even turned to known drug traffickers and illicit arms dealers to secretly acquire weapons and military supplies for the Contras in Nicaragua. It was a scandal in the United States, but nothing happened. And they absolutely could not achieve it. Yes, they were completely unable to defeat the powerful Sandinista army, and they certainly could not overcome the determined young fighters who bravely stood their ground. On another defeat for imperialism, on another victory for the Nicaraguan people.
By the way, in 1984, the government of Nicaragua filed a lawsuit against the US government at the International Court of Justice at The Hague. This is the top UN judicial authority. And 2 years later, in 1986, Nicaragua won this case. The Hague found the US government guilty of carrying out horrific crimes, including bombing civilian infrastructure in Nicaragua, blowing up oil refineries, putting mines in civilian ports, assassinating Nicaraguan government officials, and carrying out simply acts of terror. And then the ICJ ordered the US government not only to cease all of these crimes, but also to pay Nicaragua reparations. And the US government showed itself to be a complete rogue state. It completely ignored international law. The US told The Hague to get lost. The US continued carrying out this terror war in Nicaragua. And still to this day, the US government has refused to pay Nicaragua the reparations that it is legally owed according to international law. This is the perfect example of how the US empire has treated countries in Latin America as colonies with no sovereignty. This is blatant imperialism. Now, Daniel Ortega is the leader of the Sandinista Revolution. He was also the leader of the Sandinista Front back in 1979, when they finally took power and overthrew the US-backed puppet dictatorship. And in this speech, he recalled how back in the 1970s, the Sandinistas were inspired to wage their own revolution based on the example of several other revolutions around the world. He mentioned the example of Haiti. Haiti had the first ever victorious revolution in the Latin American and Caribbean region, and this was against French colonialism and also against slavery. And President Ortega recalled how after Haiti had this glorious revolution, Haiti also supported the revolutionary anti-colonial general Simón Bolívar in South America as he fought another anti-colonial war against the Spanish Empire.
How people talk about Haiti these days and how this historically significant nation, Haiti, is often mistreated and misunderstood nowadays. This was back when not a single country in all of Latin America or the entire Caribbean region had gained its independence yet. None of them had successfully managed to gain their full independence from the powerful Spanish or the formidable French colonial powers. Haiti was the first to defeat the French and expel them from Haiti. And the leaders of the struggle in Haiti, showing great solidarity, gave support to Bolivar because Bolivar didn't have many resources. And he arrived in Haiti and they welcomed him warmly and gave him weapons and ships. And then Bolivar kept evolving and growing until he turned that army into the most powerful army in the region, which was fundamental for the independence of Central America. The defeat of the Spanish.
And by the way, after Bolívar led an anti-colonial war against the Spanish Empire in the 1820s, he also came to the conclusion that the US empire was simply trying to replace the old European empires. And in a letter in 1829, Simón Bolívar wrote, quote, "The United States seems destined by providence to plague America with misery in the name of freedom," end quote. And by the way, when he says America, he means Latin America, because in Latin America, they don't call the United States America like some US politicians do. America refers to the entire American continent, not just the US. So it's clear that US imperialism follows in the footsteps of European colonialism. But getting back to the point of the revolutions that inspired the Sandinistas, in the speech on the anniversary, President Ortega also praised the Algerian Revolution, in which the people of Algeria won their hard-earned independence from the French Empire in 1962. And there were representatives from the Algerian government who were honored at this anniversary celebration in Nicaragua. And President Ortega also praised the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Chinese Revolution of 1949 as influences for the Sandinista Revolution.
In China, a gigantic revolution had already taken place, led by that great leader who is always in our thoughts, in our ideas, Mao Zedong. We are inspired by the Russian Revolution, the significant Chinese Revolution, a pivotal moment. At that time, there hadn't been any other, no greater revolution with such a huge, such a global impact.
Representatives of the Communist Party of China and the Russian Federation delivered speeches at this celebration marking the 46th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. And President Ortega pointed out that this year, 2025, is the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism in World War II. And President Ortega emphasized that in World War II, fascism was not defeated by the West. Fascism was defeated by the Soviet Union and China. And I should remind people that more than 26 million Soviets died in the heroic effort to defeat Nazi Germany. Compare that to just 400,000 deaths in the US and the UK. And 3/4 of all Nazi casualties were on the Eastern Front in the fight against the Soviet Union. Moreover, historians have estimated that up to 20 million Chinese died in World War II, and China did the bulk of the fighting against the fascist Japanese Empire, which was allied with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. But that heroic effort has largely been forgotten in the West, and Western governments claim that they were the supposed victors in World War II. In this speech, President Ortega argued that the West has never forgiven China and Russia for defeating fascism, and he argued that the reason that today Europe is remilitarizing and massively expanding its military spending is because it's preparing for war not only on Russia, but also on China. And by the way, at the 2025 NATO summit, US President Trump forced European countries to agree to more than double their military spending from 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP, which is more than most European countries spend on education. And why are they plowing so much money into the military? Because obviously they are preparing for war.
The European imperialists are talking about investing millions of dollars for the purpose of war to try to destroy Russia and try to destroy China. And now, precisely this year, the 80th anniversary was commemorated of the crushing defeat of the Nazis, of Hitler, and they were defeated by the Soviet army and the Chinese army. China and Russia defeated fascism.
Continuing in the speech, President Ortega made another very important point, which is that fascism has its roots in European colonialism. For many people in the global South, they see the fascist regimes in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, they see them as following directly in the footsteps of the European empires. And this was famously argued by the anti-colonial scholar Aimé Césaire, who pointed out that the same methods and crimes used by the European empires in Africa and Latin America and Asia, concentration camps and ethnic cleansing, and of course slavery and work camps, those were the same policies used by the fascists inside Europe after the colonialists had applied those policies outside of Europe. So President Ortega points out that European colonialism and the enslavement and trafficking of millions of Africans by the European empires, all of that was fascism before it was called fascism.
Fascism and Nazism have their roots in Europe. It is Europe that prides itself on being democratic, that prides itself on respecting human rights. And what Europe has done is fight among themselves to seize Africa, to seize Asia, and by actively colonizing numerous nations and diverse regions across the vast continent of Africa, these powerful entities sought to expand their influence. For example, the nation of France, a significant European power, ultimately cost millions of innocent victims their precious lives, a truly devastating human toll. France, at that time, was still wanting to cling to its colonial possession of Algeria. And they kept it under control for quite some time, spending huge amounts of money and suffering many casualties as well, because in the fighting, the Algerians were formidable fighters. Europeans have been racist and have passed on racism to their people. And that's precisely why Europeans quite calmly began to gradually transform into wild animals our brothers from Africa. Families, their parents, every time they were captured, they were taken to sales fairs to be offered so that Europeans could buy them and turn them into slaves. And a slave was not, as it was said here before, a servant or an employee. No, a slave had absolutely no inherent right to life when they were tragically sold to a European family or when they were subsequently sold to various North American families. These are crimes we cannot forget, that we must not forget, even more so when these are crimes that are being repeated in our times, in an era when there is so much talk about human rights, when there is so much talk about democracy.
And speaking of Western wars, another very important point in President Ortega's speech was the importance of international solidarity with Palestine. From the very beginning of the Sandinista Revolution, Nicaragua has always maintained strong solidarity with the people of Palestine in their fight against Israeli colonialism, sponsored by first the European empires and then the US empire. It was in fact the British Empire that gave its green light to the colonization of Palestine, which had been colonized by the British Empire. In the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the British Empire set the stage for the creation of the Israeli colonial regime. But as the British Empire declined and the US Empire took its place as the world's dominant hegemon, especially after the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel became an outpost of the US Empire. And President Ortega strongly condemned the horrific crimes being committed by the US and Israel in Gaza and expressed full support for Palestine.
The crimes being committed against the Palestinian people, killing thousands of children, thousands of mothers, entire families, completely destroying the places where they lived, destroying hospitals with patients inside and with doctors inside, and with the complicity of the European governments as well, to make the Palestinian state disappear. It's to erase it. They've said it very clearly. That's exactly what they've said. They are confessed criminals, well-armed, heavily armed, strongly armed by the Europeans, armed by the United States, because they want to take over that entire region.
President Ortega also sent Nicaragua's solidarity with Iran. By the way, Iran had its own revolution in 1979 in February, just a few months before the Sandinista Revolution in July. President Ortega expressed full solidarity with Iran and condemned the US-Israeli imperialist war on Iran as well. And a theme that President Ortega really strongly emphasized is how the United Nations has become completely toothless because it is now an instrument of Western imperialism. The US has destroyed the UN and abused its veto power in the Security Council to prevent any other country or group of countries from taking actions that the US empire doesn't like. And this is why the US government, under both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, has vetoed several UN Security Council resolutions that called for peace and a ceasefire in Gaza. President Ortega mentioned Miguel de Escoto, who previously served as Nicaragua's foreign minister. He was a leftist Catholic priest who supported liberation theology, although the Catholic Church expelled him because he was a revolutionary. And he strongly supported the Sandinista Revolution, and he became Nicaragua's foreign minister. By the way, in 1983, the CIA tried to assassinate Miguel de Escoto when he was serving as Nicaragua's foreign minister by poisoning a liquor bottle. So these are the kinds of terror tactics that are constantly used by the US empire. And in 2008, for 1 year, Miguel de Escoto was the president of the United Nations General Assembly. And he tried to reform the UN to make it more democratic so the formerly colonized countries of the global south can actually have a voice, so the Western colonial powers can stop dominating and monopolizing the institution. And Escoto ultimately came to the conclusion that the UN cannot be reformed. He was unable to change it because it is a rotten system from inside the system. It's not about the individual leaders and the individual people working in the UN. As a structure, it cannot be reformed, and it needs to be refounded. We need a new United Nations. And in this anniversary speech, President Ortega asked, what is the point of the UN if it cannot stop these horrific crimes against humanity that the US and Israel are committing in Gaza, or the imperial wars of aggression that the US and Israel are waging on Iran, or the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and the attacks on Libya and Syria and so many other countries? President Ortega said that the UN must be refounded. We need an entirely new United Nations that is actually democratic and actually serves the interest of the global majority.
And what does the United Nations do? The United Nations is nothing more than an instrument of the imperialist countries, of the powerful nations that truly desire to dominate the entire world, to dominate the world, even at risk of humanity disappearing, because they genuinely do not care about indiscriminately bombing and destroying everything in their path. What is the United Nations doing to stop the complete and utter destruction of the Palestinian people and all these complex, difficult, terrible situations that are being experienced? The end of these United Nations will have to come, and a new United Nations will have to be created, a new United Nations, so that we can have instruments that provide security to all nations, so that we can have mechanisms that when a people are being killed, go and stop the crimes.
So those were the words of Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinista Revolution. I think it's always very important to listen to the speeches that he gives every year on the anniversary, because he provides the perspective that is almost never heard in the Western corporate media. But these are views that are shared by many people across the global South who represent the global majority, and yet they are ignored and silenced by the imperialist West and by the corporate media that simply acts as a mouthpiece for the oligarchic regimes in the West. And as I emphasized at the beginning of this analysis today, in the global South, the perspective of the world is very different. The perspective of China and Russia is often much more positive, and they see the US as this brutal empire that is constantly violating their sovereignty and invading countries and imposing sanctions and carrying out coups d'etat and regime change operations. So it's very important to listen to these perspectives of leaders in the global South, and we here at Geopolitical Economy Report are dedicated to trying to do that kind of work to provide an alternative to the propaganda you hear in the Western corporate media. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.